In ancient Rome, banquets carried a very different meaning than what we imagine today. These were not gatherings for pleasure but political and social demonstrations, where the true measure of wealth was not refinement of dishes but their endless abundance. A wealthy host was expected to set a table so full that guests were forced to eat until their stomachs could no longer hold any more. The duty of every participant was to prove the host's generosity by consuming far beyond comfort. To stop eating was to insult his honor. As a result, participants kept going until their bodies refused, not because they wished to, but because tradition demanded it. To keep the feast from ending and allow it to last for hours, sometimes an entire night, elite Roman houses were equipped with spaces known as vomitoria. The word comes directly from the Latin vomere, to vomit. There was nothing symbolic about it. These were places designed for one purpose only, so that guests could throw up and empty their stomachs in order to return to the banquet. The architecture was simple and practical. Stone floors were sloped so fluids could run into drainage channels, and slaves were stationed to clean constantly, making the area ready for the next guest. In these spaces the grotesque rhythm of the feast was preserved, allowing the celebration to continue without interruption. A guest who could no longer continue would rise from the table, step behind a column or into one of these designated spaces, and bend forward. What he had just swallowed came back out in violent streams. Vomit hit the stone floor, the mixture of half-digested meat, wine, and bread forming a thick slurry that drained down into the channels. Slaves immediately rushed in to wipe away what remained, ensuring that no trace lingered. The guest, meanwhile, wiped his face with a cloth, straightened his posture, and calmly returned to his seat. He sat once more among his peers and resumed eating as though nothing had happened. No one saw this as shameful. On the contrary, it was recognized as a necessary step in the ritual of the feast. For Romans, vomiting was not weakness. It was endurance and loyalty expressed through the body. The ability to vomit and return to the table was a visible proof of discipline, a demonstration that the guest respected the rules of the banquet and the authority of its host. Anyone who refused, or who stopped eating and declined to rise for the ritual, risked being labeled a coward. And cowardice among the elite was unforgivable. Even those who could barely stand forced themselves to follow the cycle. They ate, vomited, and returned. Then they repeated the act again, sometimes many times in a single night. The master of the feast watched closely. For him, every guest who rose and went to the vomitorium was another sign of his own greatness. Each purge was proof that he had provided more than the human body could endure, and yet he could continue to provide without limit. His status was measured in these grotesque displays. Only a man of true abundance could feed others to the point of sickness, and still keep feeding them after. Vomit, in this setting, was not filth but evidence. It was the ultimate testimony that his wealth and his resources were inexhaustible. Thus, Roman banquets became less about pleasure and more about domination of the body for the sake of someone else's prestige. Vomitoria were as much a part of the architecture of the wealthy as atriums or gardens. They existed not for comfort, not for relief, but to keep the ritual alive. A guest was no longer simply a companion at the table. He became a vessel, filled until he broke, emptied, and then filled again. His capacity to endure this cycle, to vomit and resume eating, became the very measure of his obedience to the host and his place in the hierarchy. This practice is shocking in its grotesque reality, but it reflected the very core of Roman elite culture. Vomit was not treated as disgrace, it was treated as function. It was turned into a mechanism that prolonged the feast and magnified the spectacle of power. The vomitorium, whether remembered as a physical space or as a routine act, became a symbol of a society that transformed even the most revolting bodily processes into elements of political theater. That is why Rome gave birth to a tradition that can only be described by one phrase, the Feast of Vomit. But the Feast of Vomit was not a single act. It was a cycle that governed the entire night, a fixed order of motions that everyone in the hall understood without instruction. A guest ate until the stomach failed, rose from his seat, stepped out of the line of sight, vomited, and returned to eat again. The repetition was the rule, not the exception, and the table was arranged to support it. Platters kept arriving in waves, cups were refilled before they were empty, and seats were left unblocked so a man could stand without disturbing the person beside him. No one asked if he should continue. He continued because the ritual allowed no alternative. The Roman banquet was built on this mechanical rhythm. A man filled himself with meat, fish, oysters, bread, and wine until pain set in. He signaled with a hand or a glance. He stood and disappeared behind a column or into a side space. He bent forward and emptied his stomach, and he came back to the same plate as if the interruption had been no more than a breath. This was the structure of the feast itself, repeated dozens of times in a single night when the host wished to display abundance. Stopping early suggested weakness. Enduring the cycle suggested discipline and respect. The longer a man could keep pace, the more firmly he held his place among those who mattered. Slaves maintained the rhythm that made the spectacle possible. They brought new dishes at set intervals, cleared plates that were only half finished, and replaced them before the chair cooled. Others stood near the side spaces with basins and cloths, then moved in as soon as a guest stepped away. Where houses had drains, the floors were graded so liquid ran off quickly. Where they did not, slaves used sand and water to gather the mess and remove it without delay. The task was learned by repetition, the same way soldiers learn to march. The goal was simple: no pause long enough to break the cycle, no delay that might encourage a guest to stop. There was no shame in leaving the table and no congratulations on returning. The act was acknowledged with silence, because silence meant acceptance. A man wiped his face, adjusted his clothing, and resumed his place, while the neighbor kept eating and the servers pretended not to see what everyone knew had happened. To vomit and return was expected, and expectation turned one of the body's lowest functions into a demonstration of loyalty. The feast was not about pleasure, it was about submission to the ritual and to the will of the man who presided over it. The body became the instrument that proved endurance, wealth, and rank. For the host, this circle was the true performance. The more guests rose, vomited, and returned, the stronger his prestige appeared. He was showing that his stores of food and wine were so great that people could consume until their bodies failed and there was still more to serve. Dishes were replaced before anyone asked, cups were refilled without a word, and the musicians, if there were any, played long enough to mark the passing hours, not to entertain. Vomit was not waste in this setting. It was evidence, the visible record that abundance exceeded the limits of the men invited to witness it. Beyond the hall, the meaning of the feast changed. Food did not vanish when the night ended. Leftovers were collected at the back doors, and sweeping crews pushed refuse into piles for removal. In some houses the vomit itself was gathered with the scraps because it could not be separated once it hit the floor or the basins. The poor of the city knew the schedule of these disposals. They waited at service gates, near kitchens, or by the corners where refuse carts stopped. What the elite had vomited the night before could become food for the desperate the next day, and the fact that it had already passed through someone else's body did not end its usefulness for those who had nothing. For the wealthy, the cycle was entertainment wrapped in custom. For the hungry, it was a system of survival that relied on the overflow of other people's excess. Some households called these removals charity and spoke of generosity, but the line between alms and refuse was thin when the contents of a pile came from the floor of a banquet. The same act that elevated a host inside his hall became a sign of misery outside it. The elite measured status in the number of times a guest could vomit and return. The poor measured luck in the number of piles left at dawn. This contrast defined the society around the feast. Inside, vomit performed authority. Outside, it fed those who stood far from that authority. The ritual did not stop when a guest resumed his seat. It continued along the alleys behind the kitchens, on carts that carried away what was left, and in the hands of people who tore open bundles to find anything that could be eaten. The cycle began with the command to eat without limit and ended only when those limits reappeared on the street as provisions for the lowest ranks. So the Roman banquet was a machine with two outputs: prestige for the host and sustenance for those who lived on the margins. The body of the guest provided the proof in the hall, the heaps of refuse provided the proof in the street. Both served the same idea, abundance that did not need to stop. And from this idea came the next layer of meaning, the political one, in which every wave of vomiting and every return to the table was counted as a measure of the host's control. For the host, this grotesque cycle was never simple entertainment. It was a staged declaration of power. Every wave of vomiting from his guests was proof that his supplies of food and wine could not be exhausted, that his wealth reached beyond the natural limits of the body. The banquet was designed to make men fail, and every failure was counted as victory for the master of the house. At such a feast, the measure of power did not lie in golden cups or carved furniture. It was measured in how many times men could vomit and still return to the table. The host arranged the evening so that no pause could break the momentum. Servants refilled cups before they were emptied, replaced trays before they were bare, and ensured that music and conversation never ceased. The guest who rose to vomit did so under the silent observation of all, and the moment he sat back down, the cycle began again. The act of vomiting was not treated as collapse but as participation in the host's performance. The master himself rarely spoke. He sat higher than the rest, watching carefully. The sight of men purging themselves and then eating again was his applause. Each stomach emptied was another line of praise written into the evening. His reputation grew not because he offered delicacies unknown elsewhere, but because the quantities seemed without end. Vomit became more than refuse. It was transformed into a visible marker of prestige, a sign that generosity itself had been weaponized into a tool of domination. The logic, strange as it sounds, was accepted without protest. To vomit at the table of a powerful man was to honor him, to refuse was to insult him. The feast was not about gluttony alone but about hierarchy. The body of each guest became an extension of the host's abundance. The hall itself became a theater of obedience, where no one questioned the purpose. It was understood that a man's stomach would be used to measure another's power. This expectation hardened into ritual. Guests pushed themselves beyond what they could bear not because they wanted more food, but because the cycle demanded it. Vomiting ceased to be accidental and became required. Even the small gestures, wiping the mouth, adjusting the clothing, returning to the seat, were part of the script. To endure humiliation was to prove one's place. Those who faltered were marked as weak, and weakness in Roman elite society was never forgiven. For the host, the message extended beyond the hall. Each wave of vomiting was confirmation to the guests and to the wider city that his power had no limit. People could vomit again and again, and yet the food never stopped coming. The ability to turn human sickness into evidence of control was itself a statement of Rome's values. Authority was not only about armies or laws. It was about bending even the body to serve as proof of domination. Thus the Roman banquet grew into something both grotesque and political. Guests vomited not for themselves but for the prestige of the one who had invited them. The host watched, not with disgust but with satisfaction, as the ritual unfolded. And vomit itself, one of the most degrading realities of human life, was recast into a symbol of authority. In Rome, even the most revolting process could be transformed into an instrument of power. The endless cycle of Roman banquets did not pass without consequence. The body was not designed for such abuse, and yet the elite made a spectacle of forcing it far beyond its limits. Night after night, men strained their stomachs until vomiting became second nature. What should have been a sign of illness was instead trained into ritual. Over time, this constant pressure left its mark. The Roman upper class gained reputations for weakness of health, for bodies that looked strong in public but were ruined in private. Sources from later periods describe the toll. Chronic indigestion, distended stomachs, failing teeth, and swollen bellies were not uncommon among those who lived constantly at the table. Men who prided themselves on endurance often paid with shortened lives. But the banquet demanded its sacrifice, and to refuse was unthinkable. A guest was expected to take part, even knowing that every purge stripped away strength. He swallowed and expelled because that was what his rank required. The suffering of the body was accepted as the price of showing loyalty to the host. For the slaves who attended these feasts, the consequences were different but no less grim. They stood in the vomitoria cleaning mess after mess, handling basins and rags, washing the stones where fluids pooled. Their labor was endless, and it placed them at the lowest edge of dignity. Yet even here, the message of power was clear. The elite could command not only their peers to humiliate themselves at the table but also their servants to stand knee-deep in filth to preserve the ritual. The degradation ran in both directions. The guest sacrificed his body, the slave his humanity, and both served the glory of the host. As the practice spread through elite households, it became a marker of identity. To belong to Rome's ruling class was to prove that one could endure the banquet. Vomiting no longer appeared accidental. It was built into the design of the evening, an expected act like toasting or applauding. For the rich, it was routine. For outsiders looking in, it was shocking. Foreign observers described the Romans as people who wasted food with reckless disregard, turning luxury into spectacle while entire provinces struggled to survive on meager rations. This contradiction between excess and deprivation deepened the gap in Roman society. Inside the hall, the rich proved their might by vomiting on command. Outside, the poor survived on scraps swept from the same halls. Every purge inside the banquet carried an echo into the streets, reminding the masses that the distance between them and the elite was measured not only in gold but in the most grotesque displays of waste. To the powerful, vomit was evidence of generosity. To the powerless, it was all that remained to eat. Even within the elite, the effects were corrosive. Men grew accustomed to treating their own bodies as disposable instruments of prestige. To destroy one's health at a banquet was less shameful than failing to show loyalty to a patron. The same system that demanded strength in war demanded humiliation at the table. Rome celebrated endurance, but it was endurance bent toward ritualized degradation. By the late Empire, this culture of excess had hardened into symbol. The vomit ritual stood as proof of a society that turned wealth into waste and waste into power. The Romans who practiced it rarely questioned its meaning. It was simply what one did when invited to the house of a man too rich to be denied. But for later generations, it became a sign of decline, an image of a people so consumed by spectacle that they lost sight of balance, moderation, and the value of life itself. Thus the consequences of the banquet were not measured only in ruined stomachs or shortened lives. They were measured in the moral decay of a class that believed sickness could be transformed into a badge of honor. In the vomitoria of Rome, bodies broke, health collapsed, and dignity dissolved, all to sustain the image of abundance. What began as ritual became warning, the kind of warning that history would remember long after the tables were cleared. The tradition of vomiting at banquets did not disappear with the clearing of the tables. It became a memory, a story carried forward as a symbol of Rome's extremes. To later generations, it stood not as an example of strength but as evidence of decadence. The Roman elite had transformed one of the body's most degrading acts into a ritual of prestige, and this fact endured in history as a warning of how far a society could fall when power was measured only in excess. Writers and historians who reflected on Rome's decline often pointed to the banquet as a mirror of the empire itself. Just as men filled themselves to bursting and expelled the contents again and again, so Rome consumed the wealth of its provinces without pause, draining resources until they collapsed. The cycle of the feast became an allegory for the empire's own appetite, endless and destructive. What seemed like entertainment in the palaces was, in the larger picture, a portrait of waste and imbalance. The poor never forgot their role in this system. For them, the banquets were reminders not of generosity but of distance. The scraps, the leftovers, even the vomit itself, these became survival for those excluded from the table. Each feast drew a sharper line between the abundance of the few and the desperation of the many. The act that was meant to glorify the host instead exposed the cruelty of a culture that allowed luxury to rot while hunger gnawed at the majority. In this way, vomit became more than a detail of Roman dining. It became a cultural emblem, a shorthand for the arrogance of wealth unchecked. Foreigners described Roman feasts with disbelief, spreading the idea that the empire had grown too rich to value food, life, or dignity. Later ages repeated these stories to illustrate what happens when a ruling class loses its sense of measure. The vomitorium was remembered less as architecture than as symbol, a doorway not to comfort but to ruin. The lesson was not lost on history. Civilizations rise and fall, and each leaves behind images that define its character. For Rome, legions and laws were remembered, but so too was the grotesque ritual of the banquet. It showed that power without restraint corrodes itself, that wealth displayed without balance becomes mockery, and that societies which celebrate humiliation will one day be judged by it. Thus the Feast of Vomit remained more than anecdote. It was a truth about Rome's values, carved into memory by the very people who lived it. What the Romans once called loyalty, endurance, and generosity, others came to call excess, cruelty, and decline. And so, when we speak today of the vomitoria, we are not only describing a room or a ritual. We are naming the symbol of a civilization that turned sickness into theater and waste into proof of greatness, and in doing so revealed the path to its own decay.